Chapter 1: Four-Legged Meteor. Of all the impacts made on the colorful world of entertainment, few have surpassed that effected by the fabulous German Shepherd dog Strongheart. Sweeping suddenly into the public notice like a meteor, he became Hollywood's top-ranking screen star and its biggest box office attraction. For over 3 years he was the most admired and most loved object above the motion picture horizon. Then, with the continuing sweep of a meteor, he disappeared from the Earth scene and human visibility, leaving millions of men, women, and children admirers in all parts of the world. If you were fortunate enough to have seen Strongheart in some of his films, the mere mention of his name is sure to bring fond recollections. You will recall a big, magnificently built dog who did almost incredible things, and did them with an intelligence and ease that baffled conventional explanation. If you never saw him in the movies, he is still well worth knowing because of the great things he continues to share across time, space, and the phenomena of death itself. Strongheart came to Hollywood as the result of an idea on the part of two widely known entertainment-creating personalities, Jane Murfin, a distinguished writer of stage and screenplays, and Larry Trimble, a producer and director. Larry was in a class all by himself when it came to understanding wild and domestic animals and persuading them to work for him in front of motion picture cameras. Jane and Larry's idea was to search the world for an unusual dog, bring him to Hollywood, and star him in a series of special dramatic films. Dogs had been used before as bit players in screen stories, but this was the first time that a dog was to be given the leading role in a major production and top billing in all advertising and publicity. The dog they finally decided upon, because of his good looks, size, background, and accomplishments, was Strongheart, whose kennel name in Germany had been Etzel von Oeringen. Strongheart came from a long line of carefully bred, highly efficient, blue-ribboned shepherd dogs, all of which had won their awards not only for the finest in physical appearance, but also for their ability to work as police and war dogs. Strongheart's father was the international champion Norris, and the only dog that was ever able to beat him in open competition was Strongheart. Strongheart was a dogman's dream of a dog, having in perfection all the qualities that a dog of his type is supposed to have had. He was powerfully built, unusually capable, and utterly fearless. His weight fluctuated between 115 and 125 pounds, yet he moved with amazing speed and agility. He had to in order to accomplish what he did in military and police work. And so to Hollywood to try his luck in the movies came this big German Shepherd, a famous champion in his own country, but practically unknown on this side of the Atlantic, except to the relatively few who, for professional reasons, kept a watchful eye on dog show winners throughout the world. Strongheart crossed the United States from New York to Los Angeles in just another dog in the baggage car. There was no one of importance to greet him when he arrived, no reporters, no cameramen. Without ceremony, he was removed from the baggage car, placed in quite an ordinary automobile, and taken to a Hollywood studio where screen tests of him were to be made. None of the members of the film colony knew that he was coming, and if they had, it would have created little interest. Dogs, for movie purposes, at that time were a dime a dozen. A little over a year later, Strongheart was again placed on a train, but this time he did not have to ride in the baggage car. Instead, he was escorted with all the possible honors through lanes of excited admirers and placed in a special suite aboard the best train out of Los Angeles. He was attended by a manager, a valet, a press agent, and a special representative of the railroad who was there to see that he got the best, and only the best, of everything. By nationwide demand, Strongheart was making a personal appearance tour of the country. From coast to coast, newspapers, magazines, the radio, and electric signs were proclaiming to the world that a sensational new star had appeared in the movie heavens, that he was a dog, and that his name was Strongheart. At every stop the train made, crowds of people were on hand to acclaim the new celebrity. And in those cities where he was to make a theater appearance, special citizens formally welcomed him, hung a key to the city around his neck, and paraded him to the most important hotel where the best suite of rooms would be ready for him and his staff. Chapter 2: Good Man Friday. At the height of all this glory, there was an interruption in the busy Strongheart filmmaking schedule while new production plans were worked out. It was necessary for Larry Trimble and his assistants temporarily to leave California, and Strongheart went to live with Jane Murfin. Jane, however, received a hurry call to come to New York to help get one of her plays ready for a Broadway production. This created a major problem: what to do with their valuable four-legged property while she and Mr. Trimble were away from the city. What Strongheart needed was a kind of Good Man Friday, someone to be with him continuously as a combination companion, valet, cook, chauffeur, secretary, and private audience. This honor was conferred upon myself. Considering the fact that I knew practically nothing at all about dogs, and had almost no experience with them, the assignment was as surprising to me as I know it must have been to Strongheart. But Jane Murfin and Larry Trimble were old and understanding friends, and this was a state of emergency. I had plenty of time available and a keen inclination for such an adventure. Coming face to face with the real Strongheart for the first time was like nothing I had ever experienced before. I had watched him in all of his pictures with the professional eye of a writer and a film producer, but I had not realized until this first meeting of ours how majestic, commanding, and even awesome he was. I would no more have presumed to reach over and pat him on the head than I would have dared to pat the head of the President of the United States. The man who brought Strongheart to our meeting talked to the dog as though he were not an animal, but an intelligent human being. Strongheart was told about the emergency situation, who I was, what I did for a living, and why I was there. He was told that until further notice he and I were to live together and do the best we could for each other. Strongheart listened with alert attention, giving the impression that he understood everything that was said to him. Now and then he would turn his head in my direction and sweep me from head to feet with his eyes, as though deciding for himself whether the reports about me balanced with his own private appraisal. Then I was handed a list of instructions. The loop of a well-worn leash was placed about Strongheart's neck and the other hand in my hand, and that concluded the ceremony. Strongheart and I headed for the little house in the Hollywood Hills that I called home. As we walked along, I began reading my instructions. I was told what and when to feed my new companion, how to bathe and brush him, and what kind of exercise he should have every day. I was advised to treat him exactly as I would an intelligent human being. I was never, under any circumstances, to talk down my nose at him, to use baby talk with him, or to say anything to him with my lips that I did not sincerely mean in my heart. The instructions ended with the apparently seriously recommendation that I read something worthwhile to him every day. When we reached the house, I turned the key in the front door, but before I could make the next move, Strongheart pushed me aside, clamped his strong jaws on the knob, turned it, opened the door, and marched in as though he owned the place. I meekly followed him in, wondering what I would do to please his four-legged highness to do next. It pleased him to give the entire house a going-over, like a seasoned police inspector who wanted to be sure just what went on under that particular roof. He carefully examined every room, every window, every entrance, and every piece of furniture. He opened closet doors, stuck in at least half of himself inside, looking and sniffing, and then backing out, closing the door behind him. For some time I just stood inside the front door. Not once did he pay the slightest attention to me, and I had not the slightest idea of what I should do or not do in this situation. I had supposed that a dog with his particular background, training, and experience would wait for me, his superior, to tell him what to do and when to do it. I had no idea that he would take over and manage things to suit himself. How were he and I ever going to get along together on the basis that seemed to be inaugurating? Strongheart finally finished his inspection of the house. Then he marched with his military stride to where I was standing, gave the back of one of my hands a brief dab with his tongue, and continued on out of doors to inspect the grounds surrounding the house. I interpreted the tongue dab to mean that he had found the house and its furnishings satisfactory, at least for the time being. But I did not know how he regarded me in this new arrangement of ours, or how I was to proceed in taking care of him. But while I did not know the answers, I intuitively felt that he probably did, and that he might somehow or other be able to get the information across to me. For the first time, I understood how dumb a human can be in the presence of an intelligent animal. Chapter 3, Getting Acquainted. When bedtime arrived, there came with it the question of where Strongheart was to sleep. His daylight activities had been carefully covered in the instructions, but no one had told me where he was accustomed to sleeping. He was too important a figure in the world of entertainment and motion pictures, it seemed to me, to be asked to sleep on the floor like an ordinary dog with perhaps an old blanket under him. But it was either the floor or into bed with me. Finally, after much consideration, I decided to share the bed with him. After getting into my pajamas, I crawled to the far side of the bed, leaving the rest of it for Strongheart, the rest of it commanding the best views and being the official getting in and out side. Strongheart had been keenly watching every move I made. Evidently, he had been expecting just such an arrangement, for he immediately leapt onto the bed, towering above me in the dim lighting of the room in what seemed almost horse proportions. For some seconds he stared down at me and then began going round and round into a small circle, as though treading down invisible grass to suitable bedding for himself. When the imaginary grass, or whatever it was supposed to have been, had been arranged to his satisfaction, he flung himself down. But something was wrong, for he got up again and began doing more of that circling and stamping, this time in the opposite direction. Finally satisfied, he dropped down again, let out a loud sigh, and became very still. Taking this to mean that he was permanently down for the night, I switched out the light and let out a loud sigh too. This day's adventure was over, or so I thought. On toward midnight, when our neighborhood was at quiet, as all respectable neighborhoods should be at that hour, there was a number of sharp noises down the street, like an automobile engine backfiring. But Strongheart evidently interpreted it as gunfire, and he had been trained to do certain specific things when trouble like that started, so he took off, all 125 pounds of him. As he went out from his side of the bed, he catapulted me right out from the side of my bed. I got back into bed again, and several minutes later Strongheart returned from the adjoining room, having determined that it was a false alarm. Jumping up on the bed again, he made a few more circles, and then flung himself down with his rear end up where his head should have been, and his head toward the foot of the bed. I asked him to turn himself around. He did so, but most reluctantly. About an hour later, there was another noise outside. Again Strongheart went into action, and again I landed on the floor. As partial protection, not knowing what else to do, I pushed my side of the bed against the wall. When Strongheart returned from this second false alarm, he again lay down with his head toward the foot of the bed. Once again I had to ask him to turn himself around, and once again he did so, but as though he did not want to at all. About dawn there was yet another noise outside the house, and once again Strongheart bounded out of bed to see what was happening. This time I did not land on the floor. He merely flattened me up against the wall. I was fed up with the whole adventure, particularly so when for the third time the dog lay down with his head toward the foot of the bed. He may have been loved by millions of people, but at that moment he was a colossal pain in the neck to me. I was sorry I had ever met him socially. With some bluster I ordered him out of bed. He leapt to the floor, swung around, and stood at military attention. I sat on the edge of the bed, glaring at him. "Listen, Strongheart," I said. "I'm tired of having you kick me out of bed. It's got to stop. Do you understand? Furthermore, this sleeping upside down in bed, as you have been trying to do against my wishes and orders, has got to stop as well." Strongheart stood with calm dignity, watching my face with unblinking eyes, an enigmatic expression on his face. I continued, "You and I have to go on living with each other, whether we like the idea or not. Frankly, I don't like my part in it at all, but we're stuck with each other. I am willing to make allowances for the way you've been jumping out of bed when you hear suspicious noises, since you are a police dog, but this sleeping with your rear end where your head ought to be is out." At this point Strongheart suddenly moved forward, closed his jaws on one of my pajama sleeves, and tugged me gently but firmly to the foot of the bed. A short distance away there were some rather insecure old French windows, covered by long curtains. Getting an end of one of these in his teeth, Strongheart pulled it back, held it there for a few seconds, and then let it drop back into position again. Then he began barking, swinging his head rhythmically back and forth between the French windows and me. Had he spoken in perfect English, he could not have told me more clearly what he wanted me to know, that whenever he lay down to relax either temporarily or for his night's sleep, he always wanted to have the front end of himself, his eyes, nose, ears, and jaws aimed in the direction of possible danger. If trouble did enter in human form, he could go into action without having to lose time by turning around. And those old French windows were certainly a possible trouble entrance. Strongheart had been leaping out of bed to investigate suspicious noises, and he had been lying upside down in bed, not to please himself, but to take care of me, as he had been taught to do. As this became clear to me, I experienced a kind of humility I had never known before. We compromised the situation by turning the bed around, so we could both lie with our heads in the direction of the suspicious old French windows. Chapter 4. Puzzlement. Strongheart was so pleased with the new arrangement that he gave the side of my face a couple of dabs with his tongue, heaved a heavy sigh, relaxed like an old shirt that had been dropped into a laundry basket, and went serenely to sleep. But there was no sleep for me. I was wide awake with amazement. I had spoken to Strongheart in my kind of language, a language of thoughts and feelings encased in human sound symbols. He had actually been able to receive and understand what I had said. Then he had answered me in his kind of language, a language made up of simple sounds and pantomime, which he obviously felt I could follow without too much difficulty. Strongheart had understood me perfectly, and then with his keen and penetrating dog wisdom, he made it possible for me to understand him too. For the first time, I was actually conscious of being in rational correspondence with an animal. With the dog's patient and guiding help, we have been able to communicate our individual states of mind to each other, to exchange points of view, and thereby to solve a difficulty that threatened to mar our relationship. His innate wisdom had topped my intellectual reasoning at every point. I realized how little I knew about the mental capacities of a dog and his ability to express those capacities in a practical way. I had been privileged to watch an animal, acting upon his own initiative, put into expression qualities of independent thinking, of clear reason, of good judgment, of foresight, of prudence, of common sense. I had been taught to believe that these qualities belonged more or less exclusively to the members of the human species, or rather to the educated members of our species. And here was a dog overflowing with them. Hour after hour, I lay there listening to Strongheart's deep, regular breathing, trying to unriddle him. But the more I worked at it, the more puzzling he became. At dawn, while he slumbered peacefully on, I was still surrounded by spinning question marks, still reviewing all sorts of beliefs having to do with animals in general and dogs in particular. One thing was clear. I certainly was taking care of something far greater and more significant than just a dog, as I had been accustomed to evaluating a dog. And I saw that the important thing for me to know about Strongheart was not so much his physical body, but rather his larger, invisible embodiment of thoughts, feelings, and character. It occurred to me that if I were ever going to be able to keep really rational company with this amazing dog by my side, I would have to begin doing two important things at once. First, find out all I could about Strongheart as a mental entity, and second, try in all possible ways to discover how we were related as individual expressions of life in a highly intelligent universe. It became apparent that something which could well be spelled with a capital S had already linked Strongheart and me in inseparable kinship, even though he walked the earth on 4 legs and I only on 2, and even though according to popular human belief that dog and I appeared to be so unrelated in so many different ways. But how, I wondered, does one go about solving such kinship mysteries between himself and a dog? Who, or what, does he consult for the right directions? Or is it wiser to do such exploring alone, following one's inner leadings? Chapter 5. Keeping Company. It was not easy to qualify as a companion for the famous dog movie star. This difficulty was Strongheart himself. He was too mysterious, too self-contained, too capable, too much a sacred cow for one with my limited knowledge of dogs. What I really rated was a more common specimen, a dog saved from the city animal shelter, who not only needed a friend, but had to have one in order to escape the fate of unwanted animals. Strongheart was the most extraordinary animal I had ever come upon in any part of the world. He was particularly distinctive in his thinking processes. in the way he could reason through things for himself, arrive at his own conclusions, and then translate those conclusions into practical action without human assistance. Such independence and wisdom in a dog was hard to believe, even while watching it in operation. Strongheart had many toys sent to him by admirers from all parts of the world, and he was very fond of playing with them. When he was in the mood for this kind of fun, he would open the closet door where the toys were kept, study them for a while, then pick up the one he fancied with his teeth, back out, carefully close the door behind him, and take the toy out into the yard and play with it. When he'd had enough of this kind of fun, he would bring his toy back into the house again, open the closet door, place the plaything exactly where he had found it, and then back out, carefully closing the door behind him. If he saw me beginning any work, bed-making, house-cleaning, moving furniture, washing the car, or working in the garden, he would always insist upon helping, using his jaws in place of hands, and always making a real contribution. I had been authorized to take full charge of Strongheart and to manage all of his private and public activities, but he began reversing this arrangement minutes after we had been left together. He took charge of me as though he were the human and I the dog. His background, of course, had included police and war work, so he was accustomed to taking charge of people and things. He was not the kind of dog one would care to dispute matters of this kind with, not with his physical setup and combat record. He accepted me readily enough as his emergency associate, as he had been told to do, but he usually gave the impression that he was really in charge, and that any authority I assumed was a temporary concession. I had always considered it my privilege and right to go to bed at whatever time it pleased me to do so, and to get up again whenever I felt like it, providing, of course, that I was not acting contrary to duty. But Strongheart did not approve of this habit, probably because of his strict military training in Germany. His custom was to bounce out of bed at precisely 6 o'clock every morning, full of energy, spontaneity, and enthusiasm. He did not have to be let out. He would open all the doors and let himself out. There was an old door between the bedroom and living room which now and then would resist him on his way out. This he regarded as his personal effrontery. He would make danger sounds in his throat, clamp his powerful jaws on the knob, and throwing all of his 125 pounds into the effort, pull the old doors off his hinges. Within the hour he would come racing back into the bedroom again, supercharged with fresh air, vitality, and excitement, and start flinging barks at me to advise me that it was time for me to be up, around, and doing, especially in connection with his breakfast. If there was no response, he would pull all the clothes off the bed and drag them to the far side of the room. If that did not get results, he would take hold of my pajamas and tug on them until either I or a section of the pajamas left with him. In the evening, when he decided that I had been up long enough, he would begin barking and pulling at my clothes to inform me officially that it was time for me to quit whatever I was doing and retire for the night. If I happened to have a book in my hands, he would often snatch it from me, run into the adjoining room with it, and drop it on the bed to let me know that that was where I belonged until further orders from him. Like nearly all dogs, as well as practically all children that have not been blocked in their natural growing and expanding, Strongheart was a master of the art of living fully and completely in the here and now of things. He always made the immediate occasion and the immediate circumstances yield some kind of a dividend in interest and fun. Even when he seemed to be sleeping, this magic still went on, for his body would vibrate, twitch, jerk, and jump as he participated in all kinds of adventure in the kingdom of his own imagination. Strongheart clearly believed that life is for living and sharing as fully as possible, and that the world is not an arena but a playground. He began showing me how our relationship could be turned into a continuous holiday. Parts of this holiday we observed at home, and the rest exploring open country. The holidays at home resulted from duties which could not be avoided. While I attended to these, Strongheart would entertain himself. He sensed that I was not to be disturbed when I was at work at my desk, and he never intentionally did so. He was a constant interrupter nonetheless, because I could not resist watching him and the interesting things he did under his own planning and initiative. During these at-home occasions, Strongheart would put on his own private shows. He was the producer and manager, the entertainer, the entertainment, and the audience himself. He was the whole show, and he never gave himself a dull moment. If dullness did creep in, he would quit and do something else. The only other things he ever shared these playtimes were with bugs. They fascinated and delighted him. Whenever he found one crawling along the ground, he would trail it with intense curiosity and friendliness, trying to find out where the little fellow was going and what it would do when it got there. Perhaps the most unforgettable of these shows of his were the ones he put on with an old shoe that he had found on one of our walks, and for which he had a great fondness. He executed four-legged dance patterns with the old shoe as a kind of symbol which he alone knew how to interpret. He did dramatic play vignettes in which the old shoe seemed to serve as an emblem for everything he liked or did not like, and he gave just as magnificent a performance playing with that old shoe in the backyard, with no one but me watching, as he did in front of motion picture cameras or admiring and applauding theater audiences. Chapter 6. The Mind Reader. As day followed day in our retreat in the Hollywood Hills, far removed from the parade grounds of the current movie gods and goddesses, the stalking publicity hounds, and the ceaseless noises of the publicity sirens, the more wonderful and incomprehensible Strongheart became to me. The part of him which I slept, ate, walked, and played with was relatively easy to understand, but not the mental part of him, not the mysterious, invisible portion of him that functioned so effectively back of this physical exterior and enabled him to do the extraordinary things he did. Then one day something happened which gave to our relationship entirely new meaning and direction. It was a particularly beautiful spring morning after many days of rain. From the Pacific Ocean, shifting wind brought an exhilarating salt tang, and from the desert country in the opposite direction, a warm scent of sage. It was not the kind of day for anyone to be sitting at a desk fingering a typewriter, nor was it the kind of weather to be experienced merely through open doors and windows. Shall I be a man and finish this writing job, I asked myself, or shall I be a mouse, quit the whole thing, and take Strongheart into the hills for the rest of the day and evening? There was not much argument. I decided to be a mouse. Within a few seconds after this decision had been made, the back door was violently knocked open, and in rushed Strongheart in a frenzy of excitement. Skidding to where I was sitting, he gave the back of one of my hands a brief dab with his tongue, raced into the bedroom, and came out almost immediately with the old sweater I always wore in our outings. Then into the bedroom again and back with my blue jeans. Then came one of my walking boots. Then its mate. Then my Irish walking stick. All of these things he carefully placed at my feet. In 5 swiftly executed trips into our bedroom, he had brought to me all the things I needed for our trip into the back country. Then, bouncing and swirling and barking with everything he could put into it, he made it clear that he felt we should leave at once, and sooner if possible. I stared at him in stunned amazement. How did the dog know I had changed my plans and was going to take him on an outing? There had been no outward communication between us at all. As a matter of fact, I had not known where he was, except in a general way, for some hours. In the supposed privacy of my own mind, I had suddenly changed intention, and then he appeared on the scene knowing all about it. Until late into the night, Strongheart and I wandered about in the hill country, he looking for adventure, while I trailed after him, as intellectually dizzy and confused as I have ever been in my entire life. As we were nearing home on the return trip, it came to me that Strongheart had been reading my mind in this matter ever since our first meeting, but that I had not been alert nor wise enough to notice it before. I began to recall time after time when Strongheart must have known my intentions and plans before I had been able to set them out in outward motion. How does he do it? I kept asking myself over and over as I followed him down the trail. Is this mind-reading ability something that is innate and natural in all dogs, perhaps in all animals? Or is it a kind of special endowment that only a dog like Strongheart would have, and that someone may have helped him bring into expression? I thought and I thought, but there was no satisfying answers. Nothing but the unavoidable proof that this dog could tap my mind and read my inmost thoughts with ease and accuracy whenever he cared to do so. I began to read innumerable books about dogs. These provided a lot of material about selecting, breeding, caring for, training, exhibiting, and selling a dog to the best advantage, but none of them took me any nearer to understanding how Strongheart was able to read my private thinking. Here and there an author would begin to move in this general direction, only to veer off again and begin writing about dogs merely as biological specimens with certain professionally agreed upon price tag values. These books all dealt in physical effects rather than in the mental causes back of the effects. What I needed was someone to explain to me the mental part of a dog, to tell me about what that invisible and mysterious whatever it is that makes dogs do what they do that are so delightful to me. None of the writers I read seemed to regard such an approach as important. Then I began consulting in person all kinds of amateur and professional dog experts, from dog catchers to internationally known dog show judges. Practically all of them had had many experiences in which dogs had read their thinking as easily and as accurately as Strongheart had mine. All of them had known dogs that had been able mentally to foresee and foretell events before they happened in outward experience. But not one had been sufficiently interested to investigate such challenging phenomena. Whenever I would ask one of these experts to explain to me what it was that enabled a dog to read human thinking, as all dogs appeared to be capable of doing, and actually to see or otherwise sense invisible things, he would talk at considerable length and end by telling me that it was a natural instinct that nearly all dogs have in some degree. I would ask him what it meant by a term a natural instinct and how it functioned not only with a dog, but between a dog and a human. Then he would resume the flow of words and technical terms and disappear into professional fog, leaving me right where I was when I started. Chapter 7. Master Detective. One day, a distinguished-looking, soft-spoken foreigner with a great charm of manner came to visit Strongheart and myself. He introduced himself as an author who had been specifically sent to California by a famous European publisher to do a series of magazine articles about Strongheart, which were later to appear in book form. For some time he plied me with intimate questions about the big dog, as though he were a prosecuting attorney. He asked how Strongheart had been prepared for motion pictures, how he was handled in front of the cameras, and how certain results were obtained in certain films. When he found out that I had nothing at all to do with the dog's films or the dog's training, but was merely taking care of him while his owners, producers, and directors were out of town, the man's interest in me dropped to the 0 point, and he became rather surly. I could not quite understand this sudden change in manner. To relieve the situation, I suggested that he accompany me outdoors, where I would be happy to introduce him to Strongheart, and then he could observe and write whatever he pleased. Strongheart was walking leisurely across the back lawn as we came out. Seeing us, he stopped abruptly, with one of his front paws off the ground, and began staring at our new visitor with a look in his eyes that I had never seen there before. The hair around his neck went straight up. Then he charged. The man by my side turned and started running toward the back door, but he was too late. Strongheart caught him by one of his ankles, threw him flat, seized one of his arms, and flopped him over on his back. The dog's fangs swept back and forth, just off the man's chin, as though he were about to rip out his throat. It was almost as terrifying for me as it was for the man. Fortunately for him, he remained motionless. I managed to get Strongheart away, and to get the man back into the house. He was frightened and considerably shaken up, and he left threatening us with all kinds of legal action, as well as plenty of bad publicity. I was greatly annoyed at Strongheart for the mess he had gotten us into, and wondered what I ought to do about the trouble that was headed our way. But he was just as calm and philosophical about it as though nothing inharmonious had taken place at all. I wondered if it were possible that Strongheart had detected something in the visitor's motives that warranted that kind of treatment. Before sundown the following day, I had a complete undercover record of our visitor. He was not a writer at all. He was not connected with any publisher, nor was he any of the things that he had pretended to be. He was a professional dog trainer, and he had bought a German Shepherd dog to Hollywood in the hope of getting into motion pictures and making a fortune for himself. A rather vague, tentative contract awaited him, and provided that he could find out the secret of how Strongheart did the remarkable things he did in front of cameras, and could then top him with his own dog. The man had bluffed me completely with his appearance and pretense, but not for a second did he fool Strongheart. On another occasion, Strongheart and I happened to be in a large office building in Los Angeles, and stopped in to say hello to a lawyer friend. He was so delighted at meeting the famous dog for the first time that he wanted his legal partner, who was in a conference in an adjoining office, to meet him as well. As we entered, his partner was sitting at a large desk with 2 men at either end of it. All 3 got to their feet at once and began staring at Strongheart like fascinated children. Suddenly, and without the slightest warning, Strongheart began barking threateningly and lunged at the man standing at the right of the desk. He did not quite reach him. The choke strapped around his neck prevented it, but for the next few minutes the room was filled with excitement as the 4 other men made exits as fast as they could. They had really seen Strongheart in action. I finally got the dog out of the room, but it took everything I had to accomplish it. When things were quieted down, I apologized to my lawyer friend for the disturbance that we had caused. I also told him that I had been discovering that the dog had an ability to read the thoughts and motives of those about him. The lawyer, being a dog owner himself and also something of a philosopher, was deeply interested. By way of testing what I had told him, I suggested that he find out all he could about the real motives and intentions of the man that Strongheart had tried to attack. This was done, and to the astonishment of both lawyers, the man was found to be one of the most dishonest, big-deal promoters in the country. He was later indicted. He had a charming personality. He moved in the best social circles, and he had successfully bluffed and preyed upon innumerable wealthy people for years, but he could not fool the dog. I did not have to be within range of Strongheart's physical observation for him correctly to read my thinking and to know about all my plans. He could do it across distances as easily as though he were sitting at my side. For instance, once or twice each week, I would have lunch at a Los Angeles club that was over a dozen miles away from where Strongheart and I lived. Whenever I did this, a friend would stay at the house and keep an eye on the dog. There was never any time set for my returning, but at the precise moment when I decided to leave the club and come home, Strongheart would always quit whatever he happened to be doing, take himself to his favorite spot for observation, and patiently wait there for me to turn the bend in the road and head up the hill. Chapter 8. Dawdling. Practically everything that passed between Strongheart and myself, by way of communication, silent or otherwise, moved in only one direction, from me to him. He never seemed to have the least difficulty in sensing my unexpressed thoughts, feelings, intentions, and plans, but I could never fathom what he was planning unless he barked it across to me, or used some simple form of pantomime with his body. Day after day and night after night I carefully studied almost everything that Strongheart did. I seldom gave him orders. He was allowed all possible freedom. He really could be himself and express himself just as he pleased. Then, without warning, another one of those things happened. Strongheart and I were observing one of our most favored pastimes. We had barred the doors to all visitors, shut off the telephone, and given ourselves over to the almost totally lost art of dawdling, of lazy, lingering loafing, of doing nothing at all with determination. Strongheart was highly proficient in this art. Whenever he had anything to do, he flung everything he had into it. But when there was nothing of special interest to engage his attention, he would loosen everything and just dawdle. Strongheart and I were lying on the floor of the living room, dawdling. He was stretched out, and I was flat on my back, with my head on his ribs. The weightiest matter I had on my mind was the drowsy wish that everyone could feel as comfortable and as satisfied with life as I did at that moment. Every little while Strongheart would sound off with a deep sigh of contentment and thump his tail on the floor to let me know that all was well with him too. In the midst of this dawdling, something seemed to explode in the middle of my mind, blasting all the loafing out of me and setting me straight up on the floor. Strongheart must have felt a similar inner impact too, for he scrambled to his feet, looked quizzically about in all directions, then sat down and began staring at me with an intent expression on his face. He just stared and stared and stared, and all I could think of to do was to stare back at him. My guess was that something of a mental nature having to do with our relationship had just taken place, and that Strongheart was trying in his wordless manner to get it across to me. I tried to become as inwardly attentive and as receptive as possible. For a while nothing seemed to happen. Then I began to get a not particularly distinct mental impression to this effect, that if I really wanted to get at the facts that this big dog, I would have to stop localizing him with the boundaries of his body and begin to look for him in more expansive categories. Strongheart got to his feet, shook himself vigorously, walked the length of the room and back, and then stretched himself out on the floor, making it crystal clear that his part of the proceedings was at an end. He was returning to his dawdling, and the thumping of his tail on the floor indicated that he felt I should do the same thing. But I was through with dawdling. I had immediate and serious work to do. I felt that I must unriddle the increasing, bewildering twists and turns that our adventure was taking us. Each of us, I knew, was an individual expression of life and intelligence. And that being plainly so, I assured myself that somewhere there had to be a point of contact wherein he and I could meet with perfect understanding. But how, I wondered, does one go about accomplishing such a feat in human-dog relationships? How find about that unseen individuality of his operating behind his physical individuality? To whom could I turn for help? Suddenly it occurred to me that I had completely forgotten to get in touch with the one man who really could help me to solve the enigma of Strongheart. But could I find this man? And having found him, could I persuade him to help me? At dawn the next morning, I was headed out for the Mojave Desert. Chapter 9. Chapter 9, Desert Rat. He is known as a desert rat. The only name he has had for many years is Mojave Dan. But that is all he ever needs. He loves the desert, and it is constantly revealing to him its deeper secrets. His family consists of an assortment of dogs and burros. Often wild animals become temporary members. Dan has practically no social or economic standing, but he is rich in the kind of things that can never be taken away from him, now or in eternity. He is one of the freest men I have ever known. He has no obligations, no responsibilities, no cares, no fears, and no worries. When he needs supplies for his family and himself, he knows where to go to pan enough gold to pay for them. He never takes from the earth more gold than is necessary for his modest requirements. He goes where he pleases, when he pleases, and does what he pleases in the way that he pleases them to do it. Because of his unpredictable wandering habits, it is almost often difficult to locate Dan. The desert where he lives has an enormous spread, and he may be in any part of it. I very much wanted to get in touch with him, because up to that time he was the only human I had ever personally known who could carry on silent two-way conversations with animals and really share ideas with them. Dan never read books, magazines, or newspapers. He never listened to the radio, never watched TV, or seldom asked questions of other humans. Yet he is amazingly well informed at all times about practically everything that interests him, whether near or far. This information comes from his dogs and burros, from wild animals, from snakes, from insects, from birds, indeed, from almost everything that crosses his trail. The real mystery was not so much Dan's ability silently to communicate his thoughts to the animal, but his capacity to understand what the animal spoke to him. I had upon a number of occasions tried to get Dan to tell me how he went upon establishing such practical correspondence with non-human forms of life, but he would never do so. None of his other friends could get the secret out of him either. His reply to these requests was that such things were too intimate to talk about, and could be acquired only through personal effort and real humility. I did not take Strongheart with me on the trip, much as I wanted him and Dan to know each other. The desert at that time of year was much too hot for the big dog. Very reluctantly I left him at home, which he did not approve of at all. Arriving at the little desert town where Dan occasionally went to buy supplies, I found I was in luck. He had been there earlier in the day, and I was able to make a good guess at the spot in the desert he planned to spend the night. A few hours later, Dan and I were having supper together, companioned by his dogs and burros, his old tent, a campfire in the desert. After the dishes had been washed and stowed away, Dan and I lay on our backs and communed with the stars in that clear atmosphere. They seemed very, very near. There had been little conversation between Dan and me during the preparation of the meal or while eating. Dan goes in for such things, even with his friends, as little as possible. He believes that needless talk not only wastes energy but pollutes the atmosphere. He is a strict observer of the ancient desert rule that if you cannot improve on the desert silence, then you should keep your mouth shut. But I thought there was some excuse for a certain amount of talking on this occasion. I had a major problem in human-animal relationships, and had come a long distance to ask Dan's advice. I told him how Strongheart and I had happened to be living together. I told him of the difficulty I was having in getting at the real truth about the big dog, and I asked him what he thought I should do next. There was no response at all from Dan, just a desert silence, a silence so intense that it was rather disturbing to my city's sound-accustomed ears. Patiently I waited and waited and waited, but not a sound or a movement did my friend make. One of the two things seemed to have happened. Either what I had said did not interest him, or he had gone to sleep. Much more time elapsed. Finally Dan yawned and stretched, and then he spoke, aiming his words at the stars. "There's facts about dogs," he said, "and there's opinions about them. The dogs have the facts, and the humans have the opinions. If you want the facts about a dog, always get them straight from the dog. If you want opinions, get them from the human." A real expert on human-animal relationships had spoken. Having done so, he rolled over on his side, and this time definitely went to sleep. In those few words, Dan had given me the help I needed. He had shown me clearly where I had been making my basic mistake in the Strongheart situation. I had consulted almost every kind of an authority I could find about Strongheart, except Strongheart himself. As the sun arose over the desert horizon the following morning, I headed back for Hollywood and for Strongheart.